Hi everyone, my name is Pablo Sanchez and I'm a lecturer at Rey Juan Carlos University in Madrid, Spain. Today I'll be talking about storytelling and TV shows, specifically about how the characters in The Leftovers use the narratives related to story making in order to ensure their own survival in a post-apocalyptic world. The idea is to analyze, once the show is over, how their main characters cope with their new reality and how the shock, the trauma, and the grief post-rapture have led the stories they tell to themselves. Lastly, the overall research will distinguish between those characters with a known verbal story and others with an unknown non-verbal one. According to Chase, most narrative researchers treat narrative as a distinctive form of discourse that shapes meaning through the concerted ordering of story material. Thus, in this research, the methodology I've chosen is qualitative narrative analysis. This methodology is a step-by-step research procedure for the textual analysis of film and television stories. The qualitative form of content analysis may serve different purposes. Usually, it's used to analyze a story in film, TV, literature, and so on, to uncover its underlying thematic pattern. This pattern will be critical not only for the main characters but also for the plot resolution. The thematic pattern we recognize in The Leftovers is identity as a life story. So I'll be able to analyze the structure of the personal myths or beliefs that different characters of the show develop over 3 seasons. Human beings are natural storytellers. People construct and share stories about themselves too, detailing particular episodes and periods of their lives and what those experiences meant to them. Those stories, when referring to your own life, are known as narrative identity. Narrative identity reconstructs the autobiographical past and imagines the future in such a way as to provide a person's life with some degree of unity, purpose, and meaning. Furthermore, Lull asserts that people use narratives to make sense of the world. Therefore, narratives are how we make sense of what we know, what we feel, and experience in the world in which we live in. Personal identities are constructed and reconstructed as we share our narratives with ourselves and with others. According to Mackenzie, the central claim of narrative approaches to identity or agency is that the lives of persons cannot be thought of as a series of discrete, disconnected experiences or events. Rather, to be a person is to exercise narrative capacities for self-interpretation that unify our lives over time. Given the nature of the Leftovers plot, I'll focus also around the intersection between grief and trauma in one side and this narrative identity that functions as the foundation for the pattern mentioned earlier, identity as a life story. On the level of individual trauma, Thomas Elcesa highlights the importance of narrative as one of the most fundamental parts of trauma simulations and integration into a person's self-image. This ability to tell a story to oneself, in which the person is an active figure instead of a passive one, favor a healing process in traumatic events. The case study for this communication is the HBO series The Leftovers. The show lasted 28 episodes throughout 3 seasons. The series centers on the disappearance of the 2% of world population on October 14, 2011, in an incident called the Sudden Departure. This sudden departure is an apocalyptic-like event common to postmodern narratives in the 21st century, a time defined by multiple crises and catastrophes, echoing the exhaustion of the current form of capitalism. In the series, we follow a group of characters revolving mainly around 2 families, the Garvey family, who didn't lose any member in the sudden departure, and the Durst family, in which only survivor Nora lost her husband and 2 kids. We are introduced to 2 families who, even though suffer very differently from the sudden departure, have been equally destroyed by this event. As the series progresses, Nora Durst and Kevin Garvey will become the main characters and the most important examples of the 2 different stories who shape the reality for the survivors. The Leftovers is a show about grief and coping with excruciating psychological pain, but it's also a tale about how to use the self-made stories in order to keep on living in a post-apocalyptic new reality. The ability to enable a narrative identity is critical to, as a human being, make sense of a senseless disaster such as the sudden departure. The characters in the show can be categorized in two groups according to their position in the identity as a life story framework. Group A, those who act following a meaningless approach to life post sudden departure and therefore are unable to create their own stories. These characters are usually not able to express their stories to other people and are portrayed as stranded. Examples of this group are Kevin and Lori Garvey. Group B, those who stick to an identity related to a story regardless of the level of truth related to those some stories. Usually, these characters, not without trouble, are able to communicate their stories to others, even when these evolve and change. Characters in this group would be Nora Durst and Matt Jamison. First of all, we should talk about Kevin. This character is introduced in the pilot episode as the chief police of Mapleton, New York, where the action takes place in season 1, living with his daughter because his older son is a runaway and his wife has joined the cult called the Guilty Remnant. Kevin hasn't got a narrative identity. He's a nihilist, a man living day by day with no greater purpose or desires for the future. Not only he's incapable at the final episode of the show to develop his own story, he also refuses to accept his part in other people's stories, such as his role as Jesus in his own father's narrative. We, as audience, realize that Kevin behaves as a schizophrenic, incapable of coping with his new reality, doubting about his own sanity, and growing more and more suicidal as we enter season 2. All in all, Kevin is also a character without a narrative, agency, or purpose until he meets Nora. Nora Durst, as we mentioned before, is the show's tragic figure, the wife with no husband, the mother with no kids. She is always portrayed as a character with her own story, even though mostly that's the source of her pain. First, her story is "My kids are going to come back." After her encounter with Holly Wayne, she seems to accept the new reality, but as season 2 and 3 unfolds, we realize she has switched to another story, equally harmful. I want to reunite with my kids. Nora cannot be a nihilist. She needs a story of her own. As Kevin, she is unable to be part of other people's stories, the grieving mother, and shows suicidal behaviors. Nora learns to hate the stories people tell themselves to find comfort and solace in their losses because she becomes obsessed with the truth. For her, to build a story to survive is for cowards. Nora is attached to her grief because she feels that is the last thing about her dear lost family she can hold on to. In the show's last episode, the Book of Nora, Kevin and Nora reunite after being separated for years. It's only in this final moment when both characters are finally able to create and share their stories. For Kevin, his story is one in which he's the man who has the task to find Nora. For her, it's far more complicated. Nora shares a belief-testing tale about her visit to the place where the 2% population went after the sudden departure and how she found their kids but decided to return to our world. It's up to the audience to believe or not Nora's story. The point is Kevin does, and that's the thing Nora wants the most, be believed. Not only Nora and Kevin are capable of develop their own stories to keep on with their lives, they're fortunate enough to have people who are willing to listen to them and support them even though they are probably lying. In conclusion, in The Leftovers, we start with a group of people who have lost something critical inside of them. They've lost their relationship with meaning. Closing the narrative of the series is closing their own gaps about the meaning of their lives. Nora and Kevin are ready to accept their new reality and the love they feel for each other. Creating your narrative identity is regaining your personal agency and the ability to assign meaning to your life. Thank you very much.